Who better to talk about all of this and more than former Finance Secretary Arvind Mayaram. He joins us right now on the phone line from Jaipur. Mr. Mayaram, good morning and thank you so much for taking the time out this early in the morning and speaking to us at Bloomberg Quint. What did you make of these 3 or 4 standout points that came out? More a case of defense or more a case of points to ponder or what can really be done in order to improve the system?
No, I think the governor has made some very valid points, and one must sit back and think about it. It is very true that the dual control of PSU banks has caused a lot of problems in the past also. The issue is that if you have a banking regulator, you cannot have 2 different sets of regulation because they are also against the principles of competition, which I think is becoming more and more important now as the economy grows and becomes more mature. So I think he has made a good point. There is case for reform on that side. While there may be some merit in government having some PSU banks for the purposes of balancing the market, but it is also important that these PSU banks are governed in the same manner under the regulatory regime as the private banks are.
Right. Mr. Mayaram, this is Vishwanath here. Trying to understand what could possibly then be a solution. Will the government then need to just stay away from public sector banks completely, probably reduce their stake? This has been a conversation that has been going on for years, but nothing has actually fructified out of it. So what do you think, sir?
Like I mentioned, if there may be some merit in some banks to remain in the public sector, but they can still be companies under the Companies Act. They can be banking companies. So they should, one, move out of this protective cover of being government-owned companies, so therefore they'll be treated differently from the other banks. So regulator can regulate. As far as banking regulation is concerned, the PSU banks should be subject to the same regulation as the private banks. However, the ownership issue is different from this. I mean, whoever is the owner, it does not matter who the owner is, but regulation remains the same. I mean, today the banks can be owned by different entities, but regulation remains the same. So we must not mix up the 2 issues of ownership and regulation. I think these are 2 different issues. I mean, in terms of how we are going to, further reform the PSU banks and whether government should have majority stake there or not is a different question. But what we are speaking about today is how they should be regulated.
Right. Also, he points out about NPA management and, that being the primary focus that should be there for regulators as well as the government. But it's a problem that you've been, the banking system has been facing for the last 5 years. They've been the regulator has been very aggressively pushing for a cleanup. Again, nothing has really fructified. All you've seen is an increase in the number of NPA, but no resolution. So then what can be done there?
No, now you have the bankruptcy law is there already in place. And RBI has been tasked to identify large defaulters and then take their case and so their management can be changed so that things can happen. Now, the NPAs will have to, the management of the companies can be taken over and so on if they have been defaulting. So there must be a rapid movement on that side. And if some results are seen very quickly, I think it will have a salutary impact on the market. I mean, you cannot do 100% treatment of all the defaults in one go. But if some large examples are set, it is going to have a salutary impact on how the corporates behave as far as their debt is concerned.
Then that probably the government's involvement or this dual regulation bit that plays a part in the NPA numbers.
Again, I think we are confusing issues. NPAs relate to defaults by the corporates, right? And you are talking about PSU banks, but the default is by the corporates. And therefore, the PSU banks can also take these corporates to the launderer and get their management changed, or they can take over the assets and they can strip the assets, and so all those things can still be done. So what does
I agree with you on that point, Mr. Mayaram. But the problem that the regulator, that the RBI Governor also pointed out, is that public sector banks are just not doing that. That while they have this power and they have this responsibility, they're just not doing it. And one of the reasons he's pointing out is the dual regulation.
No, so that's why I'm explaining. So I first said, I agree with the governor that there is a need for reform to bring the PSU banks under the same regulator or under the same regulation. And secondly, the PSU banks must push hard to get some of these NPAs, especially large NPAs, taken to the bankruptcy, under the bankruptcy code. And it is for now the resolution to happen quickly on those, so that there is an example which is set. So it is a concerted effort by everybody. That's not just the RBI, but government, RBI, and the PSU banks all will have to work in concert.
You reckon that the comment by the Reserve Bank Governor that if the Banking Regulation Act strengthened would help the Reserve Bank, or both the government and the Reserve Bank, to deal with this menace of the NPAs in the PSU banks a lot more effectively than it's being done currently, Mr. Mayaram?
No, I don't think that is enough. I think RBI also is remiss in one fact, that their own regulations are not really looking at a large number of issues like conflict of interest within the functioning of the banking sector. And therefore, it is not just one part of it that, now that the government gives away its regulatory authority to the RBI, things will fall in place. It doesn't work like that. I'll give you one very small example. I'll give you this example of, you have, when you issue bonds, the SEBI requires the debenture trustee to be appointed, which will be a third party, which will validate the assets, underlying assets of that bond, and ensure that at all times the bonds are backed by the assets. Now, this is not true in terms of loans that the banks are giving to anybody. Now, what happens is, what happens most of the time is, if you have mortgages, for instance, if you have sureties or securities which are given to the banks, these banks have themselves now established their own trustee companies. So each bank, most of the banks have their own individual trustee companies. And these trustee companies are now tasked to take care of the sureties and securities. Now, how does that work? There's a conflict of interest there. The ownership of the trustee company is of the bank, and the bank is now asking this as a third party to ensure that all the securities that have been given for loans or have not been given, then contingent liabilities that arise from that are properly accounted for. It doesn't work in that sense. So there is a lot of conflict of interest happening in the banking industry today, which the RBI should be mindful of and should be looking at. This is a system reform within the banking sector. It is not just PSUs, but even private banks. But the RBI must also look at its own regulation and see how, it is really working on the ground.
Yeah, well, I'm sure this is probably one example. There would probably be more such things as well that need to be looked at. But I'm glad we had this conversation this early in the morning, Mr. Mayaram. Thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking with us today.
Thank you.